Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the Industry Needs, the State of Green Jobs. My name is Annie Garniva, and I'm the Vice President of Policy and Special Initiatives here at the New York City Employment and Training Coalition. Thank you so much to all of our members that have joined this afternoon, and a special thank you to Amazon, Facebook, Google, LinkedIn, and Verizon for sponsoring this series. NYC ETC supports the workforce development community to ensure that every New Yorker has access to the skills, training, and education needed to thrive in the local economy, and that every business is able to maintain a highly skilled workforce. The coalition's membership is composed of 190 workforce development providers, education institutions, and labor management organizations that provide job training and employment services to nearly 600,000 New Yorkers. Today, in this first installment in our multi-part Industry Needs by Sector series, we'll discuss the state of green jobs and strategize on measures being undertaken to grow businesses and train workers in the variety of sectors and occupations that make up the evolving green economy. Today, we have the pleasure of hearing from a great panel of leaders that represent that variety of businesses in the green economy, from green tech and innovation to construction and clean energy. As you'll see from the labor update presentation and the overall discussion, this sector is particularly impacted by public policy and investments. We are in the midst of a critical change moment, with federal and state policy moving toward more and more support and clarity on issues of clean energy, resiliency, and sustainability. Just yesterday, Governor Hochul and the New York State Department of Environmental Conservation denied the permits of two massive fracked gas power plants in Astoria, Queens, and Newburgh, New York, citing the state's climate law and calling for a shift to a renewable future. These are important signals to businesses and the workforce and economic development community, and we must work together to ensure that accessible skills training for our communities, especially environmental justice communities, is at the core of the growing green economy. All participants should know that you'll be muted for the duration of this webinar. I'll moderate a discussion with our speakers and discuss the state of their communities and what else can be done to keep businesses open and get workers employed. Before we start the panel, we'll hear from James Parrott, Director of Economic and Fiscal Policies at the Center for New York City Affairs at the New School, who will provide a labor update on the sector. Nice to see you as always, James. The floor is yours. You're muted, James.
There we go. Can you hear me now? Sorry about that.
Yep.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks, Annie. I just want to give a brief overview of the state of the pandemic economy in New York City and say a few words to try and help us, get our arms around the green economy sector and the what the outlook is and the kind of jobs that it encompasses and so on. If I could have the first slide. Thanks. Basically, I want to talk about four things. One, I want to talk about the state of the city's economy and how the pandemic has had extremely disruptive job market effects, hitting hardest at low-income workers of color. The magnitude of the unemployment crisis in New York City is far greater than what it is at the national level, and I want to underscore that a little bit. And without greater labor market interventions on the part of the city and the state, my concern is that we're going to see years of double-digit unemployment rates for communities of color in New York City. But if we recognize the opportunities represented by the green jobs economy sector, we can help moderate some of that economic and employment challenge. I want to say a little bit about, for people who've been around for the past decade, you might still recall some green jobs fatigue from several years ago when there was a lot of interest, coming on the heels of the Great Recession, 2008, 2009, in a booming, what was then portrayed as a booming green jobs economy. And that boom sort of fizzled before it really got substantially off the ground. But I want to underscore the fact that, now through a combination of the sort of policy changes that Annie alluded to, along with very clear market and technological changes, the green economy really is, it's already, a pretty significant factor at the national level. And the outlook for continued job growth in the years ahead is pretty significant. We need to be mindful of that and begin to focus more on that in New York. Green economy, I want to talk a little bit about the range of occupations in several industries, how to define the industry, say a couple of words about some of the training programs that can help prepare people to get into this sector. It's very clear that this sector offers significant good paying job opportunities if those are shaped appropriately for workers with less education background. So it's a really attractive opportunity for New York City. But to make this happen, we need to have a better understanding of what these opportunities are, and we need to have the workforce investment support of the city and the state so that we can clearly build back better and incorporate a green jobs future into New York City's rebound from the pandemic. Let's go to the next slide. Yeah, so this chart shows the employment levels relative to the pre-pandemic month of February 2020 for New York City and the US. And we also show, for comparison here, New York State and the rest of the state overall. And it's very clear that the impact in the first couple of months was much steeper in New York State and City. And our rebound, it's been, this year, 2021, it's been sort of in line with the rebound at the national level. But because we declined so much more steeply in the first couple of months, our rebound last fall left us far short of where the United States was and where we needed to be. So as of September, we just got the September employment numbers for the city and the state last Thursday. New York City is still down over 10% jobs. That's more than 3 times the 3.3% decline at the national level. New York State has been hit harder than all other states, including all large states. And it's not just, and New York State's numbers aren't bad just because of New York City. The rest of the state, if the rest of the state were a separate state, its job decline numbers relative to February of 2020 would be worse than any other single state. So it's also an issue in the suburbs and upstate, but it's clearly more pronounced in New York City. On the next slide, you'll see, the next slide is not updated to the latest data, but it shows that through August, the September numbers were, would actually make this look a little bit worse. This is bad enough to begin with. We organized, the 20 or so major industries into 3 broad categories that we found useful for analyzing the pandemic's effect on the New York City economy. So we have the essential industry category, face-to-face industry category, where that bore the brunt of the business closures and job reductions. This includes leisure and hospitality, retail, but also manufacturing, construction, other services. And then finally, there's the remote working industry category, where a lot of higher paid workers work: finance, professional services, information. Tech is sort of divided between information and professional services. These industries, a lot of workers were able to pivot and work remotely, but the job declines were a lot less. So you can see clearly from this chart that we're still down nearly 500,000 jobs compared to where we were before. And almost 400,000 of this job decline is concentrated in the face-to-face industry category. And you can see large, pandemic to date declines in leisure and hospitality, in retail trade, and transportation and other industries. That's where the bulk of the continuing job impact has occurred. On the next slide, you get some idea of the profoundly disproportionate impact on less educated, lower paid, predominantly workers of color in New York City. So this chart shows by these different demographic categories, education, age, earnings, the likelihood of losing a job in the pandemic relative to the average for that demographic category. So workers with less education, only a high school degree or less, 23% more likely. Person with a 4-year degree, 20% less likely, and so on. Young workers very heavily affected, immigrants more heavily affected than native-born workers, and low-income workers hit a lot harder than high-income workers. So this was true in the first 2 months, and it's still true today, a year and a half into the pandemic's economic impact. Next slide, please. So clearly we're facing a profound unemployment crisis and economic challenge in getting the jobs back that we've lost. There's also the potential and the promise and the need to build back better so that we have a better economy with better opportunities for the traditional clients of workforce development organizations than what we had before. There's a lot of concern these days that the unemployment that exists is a function of workers choosing to not go back to work yet. That basically the unemployment is because workers are jobless by choice. And there's, we see stories every day in the press about this. Undoubtedly, that is the case for some workers, but given the sheer magnitude of unemployment in New York City, it can't be that New York City workers are 3 to 4 times more reluctant to go back to work than their counterparts nationally. This jobless by choice narrative just doesn't fit the case of most workers who are still without work in New York City. Again, some workers may be in that category. They may be concerned about public health concerns or because of lack of childcare or family care responsibilities, not yet ready to go back to work. But I don't think it's predominantly the case that that's the issue for New York City workers. Most workers haven't gone back to work because they haven't been called back to work because their businesses do not have enough consumer demand yet at this point. Partly that's because of the very slow recovery underway in the leisure and hospitality sector. Foreign tourists haven't even come back to New York City yet at this point. Broadway is reopened, but the arts and performing arts and broader recreation and entertainment sector still has a way to go. Hotel occupancy is better than it was a few months ago, but it's far below where it was before the pandemic. We still have, very high unemployment. The official unemployment rate, the way it's measured for the third quarter of this year, would be 25% for young adults. When you factor in involuntary part-time employment and discouraged workers, those workers who've stopped looking for work because their job prospects are not that great, that if we add those workers, the involuntary part-time plus discouraged workers, to the unemployed, we get an underemployment rate. And as of the third quarter, that is the months of July, August, and September, That was 11% for white workers in New York, 17% for Blacks, 18% for Latinx, and 16% for Asian and other workers. Nearly half of all the unemployed workers in New York have been unemployed for more than 6 months. And we know from a lot of painful research that long-term unemployment has very adverse consequences for the unemployed workers themselves, for the businesses that they used to work for their family members, and so on. We also need to keep in mind that COVID has changed the mix of consumer demand. It's had an effect on business practices. These two factors contribute to permanently reshuffling employment demands. So even if we wanted to sort of get back to where we were before, that's not possible because the economy has changed in the meantime. That means we need to have a better informed workforce development system to identify how those employer needs have changed, identify dislocated workers, those workers whose jobs are permanently gone, and help those workers identify assess what their opportunities are, and help them connect to the skills and education training that they need to reconnect with the job market. Next slide, please. So here I think is the unfortunate consequence if we don't do more to respond to the current situation. The federal aid, the extended unemployment benefits, federally funded, have run out. They've been out now for 7 or 8 weeks. There are no longer new streams of business assistance funding. There is some funding that the federal government has provided to New York City and New York State with some flexibility in how to use. I would argue that the city and the state needs to use some of those resources to figure out how to more effectively restart the city's economy. The consequence, if we don't do that, we're likely to see double-digit unemployment rates for Black and brown workers, as we have seen in each of the last 3 significant economic downturns. And I show on this chart what happened after the early 90s downturn, after the early 2000s, and after the Great Recession. Several years, from 4 to 10 years in the case of the early 90s recession, where unemployment rates stayed high for a long time. The city and the state didn't do anything special in those recovery periods to address high unemployment. We have a choice at this point, and we have resources. Next slide. So let's talk about the green economy. I mean, it's a little squishy and hard to exactly define. It's not a single industry. It's not a single occupation. We also have to recognize this green jobs fatigue that I talked about earlier. There was a lot of concern right after the Great Recession about the prospects for green jobs, and that seemed to never really materialize on a significant scale. The current situation is different, though. It's real this time. We have lots of policy examples to point to, and we have a lot of market developments that clearly signal that that's the case. The BLS, as part of the Federal Labor Department, had started to try and estimate the magnitude of the green goods and services sector in, right after the Great Recession. But because of budget sequestration, they stopped that series in 2013, and they haven't restarted that yet. So we don't have the benefit of what their current estimates are. A recent Brookings study, though, did try and identify, occupations in what it identified as 3 subsectors in the part of the green jobs economy. So one was clean energy production, Renewables, obviously, is a big part of that. Energy efficiency, retrofitting buildings, residences, and so on, and environmental management more broadly as three sort of subsector components of the green jobs economy. There's also an interesting study out of the UK, which tried to identify that also. And in the next slide, we're going to look at some numbers from those two studies. The UK study, labeled this sector, and I think there's some value in this, the low carbon and environmental goods and services sector. These two approaches cover a lot of ground. Given recent developments and given developments in New York City, one could conceivably sort of broaden the definition of the green jobs economy to explicitly encompass resiliency projects and efforts and the jobs needed to make those happen, and sustainability, for example, in food as a way of promoting local food production to minimize transportation cost and the environmental consequences of that, and so on. Some people may think that food production and distribution has always been part of New York City's economy, and that's not new. But I think you can point to some recent developments that do indicate sort of a broadening of that interest and potential. And the next slide, again, I just wanted to underscore that the green jobs potential is not an illusion at this point. We've seen very clearly in recent years the success of renewable energy production, and prices now lower than in many cases for fossil fuel production. And of course, there was that historic announcement earlier this week where Hertz Rental Car is going to buy 100,000 Teslas. And you can imagine what that's going to do, giving, allowing many people to test drive a Tesla and experience that, and that possibly could lead to really ramping up the electric vehicle consumer demand market, which has already been growing by leaps and bounds. And if you follow the announcements of the major automobile producers, they're all really orienting their future production plans to electrical vehicle production. So the market is sending loud and clear signals that the green economy is here, and it's going to continue to grow. On the local side, there's clear policy examples. Local Law 97 passed in 2019, which will start placing carbon caps on the 50,000 largest residential and commercial buildings in New York City. That's basically all buildings with more than 25,000 square feet, and it's going to phase in their emissions reductions to 80% by 2050. We've already seen significant investments, a lot of it funded by the federal government after Sandy, to make the city's landscape more resilient to the kind of more intense weather events that we're seeing. And there's a lot of talk about how the city needs to respond more effectively to storms like Ida, which dumped an unprecedented amount of rain in New York City in a short period of time. Next slide. So there's clearly a big challenge in quantifying the green economy sector. Again, it doesn't neatly conform to existing the classification of industries or the classification of occupations. It cuts across a lot of those. So I refer you to these two studies, and I can provide I'm sorry, I didn't provide the full links to these. The Brookings study identified 320 unique occupations in these three subsectors. The total number of jobs that it identified in the United States was 6.6 million. This UK study used a very interesting methodology, looking at multiple sources of economic and business data to try and get at the entire supply chain in the green job sector, from renewable energy production to resiliency and energy conservation efforts. They identified through that methodology almost 10 million jobs as of 2019 in the United States. This next citation is from the National Association of State Energy Offices. They tried to quantify various energy sector jobs. And what I found very interesting from that study is that already there are more jobs in solar energy production than in fossil fuels. So in the United States, nationwide, 2019, 242,000 jobs in solar compared to 211,000 in fossil fuels, encompassing coal, gas, and oil exploration. And also 111,000 jobs in wind energy in the United States. I'm sorry, I don't have an estimate of what the number of green economy sector jobs might be in New York City. I've just started to, try and better understand this sector. So we're not there yet, and I didn't come across any other estimates along the way. Next slide. So what are the jobs in the green economy sector? There are some occupations that are clearly green jobs. In the BLS's recent 2030 occupational employment projection, it identified as two of the three fastest growing occupations in the United States: wind turbine service technicians and solar photovoltaic installers. I mean, neither of those are huge sectors, and the total job growth expected over the next decade in those two occupations is only about 11,000. But that's it's effectively like a 70% growth rate in those two occupations. I think that does, there aren't other sort of clearly definable, green economy occupations, but there's a lot of green economy work in many traditional sectors, and particularly in the building trades, among electricians, among sheet metal workers, among laborers, carpenters, on down the line. Every trades, some portion of those jobs are increasingly, focused on green economy activity of one sort or another, and the demand for that is rising in New York City. What was one of the things interesting about the Brookings study was that in looking at the occupations that they identified, it's very clear that these jobs in the green economy pay better than average. And on average, the workers who now hold those jobs have, they don't require a 4-year college degree in many cases. But there are many trades-related jobs that with sufficient skills, vocational and apprenticeship training, in many cases, workers who have less formal education can go through these training programs, and the result is a decent paying job with good benefits. And that's exactly the sort of job for which there's high demand, given our workforce in New York City, and particularly in light of the displacement effects of COVID. Less educated workers of color, many younger workers. So green economy jobs are a suitable match if we can figure out how to make that match. There's an interesting analysis from LinkedIn recently that identified, of course, there are a lot of white collar jobs in the green economy as well. And you don't necessarily need to have a degree in environmental engineering or conservation to get a white collar job in the green economy. But this LinkedIn analysis shows that many of the people applying for those jobs and getting those jobs are, come from other sectors as analysts or accountants or lawyers or English majors or whatever from other sectors. Those workers with experience are applying for and getting hired for these jobs. Next sector, and then I'll wrap up. Next slide. Thank you. So I think there is opportunity here, and it's particularly needed given the unemployment challenge and the changed nature of the economy that we're looking at. But there needs to be a capacity to identify the jobs and businesses, to assess the workers, and connect those workers to and expand training and supports to equip those workers to get those jobs. So this is an opportunity and an instance, I think, where the workforce development sector needs to more closely align with environmental justice organizations, with community organizations, and the trade unions that have apprenticeship programs to connect more New York City workers with these opportunities. And in a very unusual occurrence, at this point, we not only have a great need, but we also have resources at the city and the state level. We've been tracking that at the center. Both the city and the state have billions of dollars in federal resources with the flexibility needed to fund this sort of large-scale workforce development effort that we're talking about. And hopefully the new leadership that we'll see at the city level, together with new leadership at the state level, will recognize this as an opportunity and a need. All right, thank you. I'm going to stop.
Thank you, James. That was very extensive, and especially given the challenge that you talked about, even defining the sector, which of course we'll explore during our discussion. So now I will introduce our incredible panel, who are 4 powerful voices and leaders in New York City's green economy and business community. Joining us today are Ross Gould, who's Vice President for Supply Chain Development at the Business Network for Offshore Wind. We also have Chante Harris, who is Director of Climate Investment and Partnerships at SecondMuse. We have Keith Kinch, General Manager of BlocPower, and Katie Nilsen, Director of Development and Strategy at EJ Electric Installation. Nice to see you all, and thank you so much for being with us today. Hi, Katie, nice to see you. Great. So we'll just dive right in. If you could each introduce yourself for a minute, talk about your organization or company and your organization's role in the green sector. So we'll start off in alphabetical order with Chante.
Hi, thanks so much for having me. Again, Chante Harris, Director of Climate Investment and Partnerships for SecondMuse. We're a global innovation and impact firm that really looks at place-based innovation that can drive economies of the future that are more inclusive, sustainable, and regenerative. We've been doing work in New York now for close to 5 years, really focused on the manufacturing sector. And of course, that has overlap with climate. And so what we do is really search for innovators, not only in New York, though the intention is that they are both New York focused in terms of their ability to deploy their technologies here, as well as how they fit into the greenhouse gas emissions based out of New York City and New York State. We're powered by NYSERDA, and we have essentially two programs that really look at early stage climate tech, Venture for Climate Tech, which is the venture studio and accelerator hybrid model that I run, and then Scale for Climate Tech, which is really focused on companies that have a prototype, are going through the manufacturing process, and trying to figure out how to get to commercialization and deployment. So yeah, we've been doing a lot of work in New York for years now. And New York really has been setting, I think, the stage for how governments can support R&D, innovation, and really drive longer term economic growth.
Great to have you. And Katie?
Hello, everyone. I'm Katie Nilsen. I'm the Director of Development and Strategy for EJ Electric. EJ is a 122-year-old electrical contracting firm and a leader in renewable energy. We also service additional markets, including transportation and infrastructure, commercial, just to name a few. So right now, EJ is down in Louisiana, where we're providing storm response after Hurricane Ida. But some projects locally include the installation of battery energy storage systems at the Barclays Center, as well as various solar and EV charging infrastructure work throughout the 5 boroughs. So EJ is a union electrical contractor, and we employ just over 1,500 people and work with various city and state agencies, utilities, and private entities. Happy to be here today. Thank you.
Thanks, Katie. And Keith?
Hey, good afternoon, everyone. I'm the general manager and co-founder of BlocPower. BlocPower, we're a clean tech startup that makes buildings healthier, safer, and greener. We've been around for 8 years. We utilize our software to provide engineering analytics, financing, and project management to buildings across this country. We completed close to 2,000 projects the last 8 years, many of them in New York State. Our goal is to lower carbon emissions and get buildings off fossil fuel and electrify their heating systems. Just recently, we were awarded with the Mayor's Office of Criminal Justice $37 million workforce program, in which we are training and placing on jobs over 1,500 participants across New York City, with a focus on areas that had a high rate of gun violence. We're doing that now. We currently have about 900 people active between training and working on clean energy job sites across the city. So excited to be on a call with all of you.
Thanks, Keith. And Ross?
Sure. Thanks, Annie. And thank you very much for the invitation to be here with you all today. My name is Ross Gould. I'm Vice President for Supply Chain Development at the Business Network for Offshore Wind. And I'm actually one of the jobs that, the white collar transfer jobs that James was talking about earlier. I'm a lawyer by trade and transitioned into clean energy work and environmental work about a decade ago. So for the last decade, I've been working on policies and programs to build a renewable energy market in New York. I've worked with government, business, labor unions to design programs, share information, and support green jobs in New York. And in December of 2020, I joined the Business Network after 5 years of directing the Energy and Climate Program for the Workforce Development Institute, where I specialized in clean energy jobs, but really focused on jobs in the offshore wind industry. At the Business Network, I oversee the network's work to expand and evolve the supply chain. I work to design and develop programs that help share information and teach companies about the supply chain and points where they can enter. And I also oversee the Business Network's workforce development initiatives. Now, the Business Network, we are a member organization, over 400 members strong, with a mission to grow the offshore wind renewable energy industry and its supply chain and its workforce, we do this by connecting businesses. The network has brought together 9,000 individuals and over 2,000 businesses at over 80 events. Offshore wind represents an enormous opportunity for the nation to further develop our renewable energy resources while creating new economic benefits for American companies and workers. And we, at the network, track advancements in the market. We also work with our members who are project developers, original equipment manufacturers, the manufacturers of the turbines and the towers, vessel operators, electrical contractors, labor unions, and others in trying to help them build the market. And we work with them in understanding what their workforce needs are and try to get an understanding of what the workforce, we don't hire, yes, we hire, but the people that are hiring are our members. So I'll talk from our members' perspectives throughout this day. So thank you, and I look forward to the conversation.
Excellent. So we want to get started just thinking about how we define the green economy as a whole and different elements, and how your organizations and companies perceive elements of green economy and the workers that you're representing. So as we've talked about so far, part of this challenge is that we can talk about it from a sector perspective, such as renewable energy, construction, building management, and landscaping, but we can also talk about it from a skills and roles perspective. So how particular sectors are integrating sustainability and resiliency into their systems and practices that already exist and transitioning to being green. So from your own point of view, how do you define or think about the green economy? And how do you, whether it's from a sector or a skills perspective, and how would you encourage training providers on the other side to kind of broaden their thinking while building out training programs? And I guess we can start, why don't we start with Katie?
Okay, sure. I think speaking from the construction industry, I do think we think about the green economy from both a sector and a skill perspectives, a little bit heavier on the sector perspectives. It is very hard to define, but it's really anything for us that benefits the environment. So it can be projects such as solar installations, EV charging that I spoke about earlier, or sustainable people. And what we're seeing is things like Local Law 97 and New York State's commitment to clean energy that's really helping to drive this.
And Ross, did you want to go next?
Sure, happy to. I agree with Katie. A green job, in my perspective, is any job that is within a sector or within a project that is going to be reducing our environmental impacts, or helping to mitigate climate change, or making resiliency environmental resiliency, and make us more resilient to storm damage as a result of, to protect us from hurricanes and things of that nature. But at the heart of it all, these are, clean, renewable energy jobs. These are jobs where people are working in mass transportation. So your subway, the MTA and subway personnel are green jobs because they're getting people out of their cars, right? But there are jobs that are focused on improving our environment and in reducing our society's impact on the environment and protecting our natural resources and public health.
I'm happy to jump in. At SecondMuse, we really look at green jobs from an innovation and an investment perspective, particularly because there was an article that came out yesterday that essentially said the next 1,000 billion-dollar companies will be climate technology companies. And I think that matters not only for all of the industries I think Katie and Ross were alluding to, but also in terms of what it means to have new companies in the space, right? And ultimately driving different opportunities for job transitions, but also I think upskilling and training. And so we think a lot about, again, place-based innovation. And I think the thing about climate that's really interesting, or climate tech, as everyone's calling it now, I know a lot of people knew it as clean tech, but it's just this huge bubble. And we saw over $17 million come into climate investment in just the first two quarters, of 2021. And so I think, wherever you see investment and you see dollars, the reality is that there's an opportunity to not only innovate, but to build new companies and thus employ people. And I think, what BlocPower is doing is a great example of that. There's another company based out of California called Charger Help, and they're really upskilling and skilling not only low income communities and sort of underrepresented communities historically in the sustainability industry, but also those most disproportionately impacted by the climate crisis, and ensuring that there's an entire worker economy around the maintenance. I think that's oftentimes something that gets left out of the conversation, or people just sort of overlook. But the reality is, as these technologies get deployed, and they're not just technologies, right? There's new solutions, there's new business models, they have to be implemented, and many of the technical pieces, or even the science pieces, right, have to have lab space, have to have manufacturing aspects to what they do. Many startups have to build facilities, right? And so there's a huge role for construction and labor in this conversation. So we like to, of course, look at it from, where are we investing in terms of the startups that we're looking at, but then as they scale into growth stage companies and ultimately, established companies, really what is it that they're going to be driving in terms of the economy and the people they're employing. And I think it's really important for government to be at the helm realm of ensuring that as these companies scale, they have the right talent, that workers are being upskilled or at the very least aware of sort of how their jobs could transition, how they could make more money. There's a lot of money to be made in this sector, right? But I think it's really about us getting at the forefront of it and making sure that existing workers in the space, know about the opportunity. So we really like to take a holistic standpoint. We're not Silicon Valley folks who are just like move things and are move things quickly and break things and move quickly. We really look at how do you intentionally innovate and how do you drive economies.
I mean, yeah, I hope we're one of those companies that was mentioned by Bill Gates. That's my plan, to be a billion-dollar company. So.
I think so. Maybe I saw you all in the article.
I thought that's why you referenced us. I thought Janelle had told me something or did not. I was excited about. But yeah, I mean, I think to all your points, yeah, any job that lowers carbon emissions moves us further away from fossil fuels and continues to cut in and provide more equity and generational wealth for frontline communities is what I consider a climate tech or green job. I think Katie brought up a point, and then Russ touched on it. There are certain jobs that are not front facing. I think to Chante's point, that's important. Like, we're looking at EV charging stations. That's great. Someone's got to maintain those stations, right? Someone's got to make sure that the actual car is running properly. So there are a lot of quote unquote hands-on jobs that are not as innovative. But then at the same time, there's a super innovative set of jobs that are like, who's managing the technology between the stations working, who's making sure the solar panels connect with the air source heat pumps. When you leave your home at night and the building says, hey, it's going to be 65, make sure the heat is set on X. Someone has to make sure that app runs properly to manage the building. So when we think about the green economy and the billions of dollars that can be generated, there's so much to do just besides, drilling refrigerant lines and putting in air source panels. Putting in solar panels. So I think we just need to be very, broad about that so that we don't, one, narrow folks in the market to say, if you're not doing X, this is not part of the market. And then two, continue to expand the market and think about what's important and be more inclusive.
That's really interesting. And I remember actually during our prep call, a point that really stood out to me from Ross was for workforce organizations to think about not just, to your point, niche occupations, but to look at the entire ecosystem of policy that's coming up as a way to figure out where to train, because we are kind of experiencing this build it as it's getting built moment. And if we don't focus on creating the training programs, our communities will get left out. So just really excellent points all around.
Yeah, and just on that, like, I also want to make sure that it's clear, like, yes, we're talking about defining green jobs and the definitions can be all over the place, right? I think it's really important from a workforce development perspective, from a trainer's perspective, is whether the job is a green job or not doesn't really matter at the end of the day. What matters is the skill sets that are required for the job and that you're training to the skills for the job. And that's the important piece. It doesn't matter if the job is in the fossil fuel industry or anywhere else, or if it's a green job.
Thank you. So that was actually a perfect pivot to my question around talent development is if you could talk a bit about the career pathways that you see within your particular kind of subsector within the green economy and the kind of skills that you're looking for, whether you're advocating for members that are looking for those skills or directly how your company perceives hiring for the variety of positions that you have. Why don't we get started with Chante?
Sure. I guess, I'll speak to how we view ourselves in terms of pipeline. I think the reality is that the climate tech founder archetype has not been a diverse one. I think we can all acknowledge that here on this call. And so one thing that myself and then our managing director, Jackie Amable Ross, who was one of the first Latinas to raise millions of dollars for a hardware startup when she was building it back in 2015. My background is being an operator and really a go-to-market strategist scaling companies at, not only the established phase. So thinking of like the largest fleet manufacturer in the world and the leading hydrogen fuel cell electric vehicle charging company, but then over time that portfolio growing to growth stage companies and then early stage startups. The reality is that we know that if we don't have, the best talent, and that means diverse talent, really thinking through the ideas and the solutions to launch new companies, that we're going to miss the mark. We really need everyone, and we need everyone's great ideas, but also different approaches to not only create solutions, but also build companies. And so, when we launched our venture studio, we were very adamant about not only sourcing globally, but also thinking about it from an equitable perspective, and building that into, not only the sourcing of our founders and the solutions they're building, but then also, the mentors, the investors, really this larger community and ecosystem we're building around climate tech in New York. And one initiative in particular that we're looking at launching is really an apprenticeship and a fellowship program for underserved communities who have historically, not even looked at, I think, climate tech and the innovation ecosystem as an option, who aren't necessarily educated around that. So I think that's certainly one piece to the puzzle in terms of how do you, not only identify great talent, but build them up and sort of get them to understand what climate tech is, because I think a lot of people, you hear it said, but you don't actually know what it means and what it could turn into. But I always tell people, at one point Tesla was a startup, right? And they actually got a lot of support from government, right? And incentives, and particularly on the R&D side and the scale side. And so I think for me, it's, what does it look like for our innovation ecosystem to be representative of, a place like New York and the diversity of New York? And so I do think, on our end, we really try to not only recruit, but also start to train those who might have really amazing ideas. And many of our founders are coming from an academic background, PhDs, very much on the science, again, the technical side. And so our entire model actually pairs them with established folks in the industry, whether that's on the corporate or the public sector side, to help them build strong founding teams and making sure that they have really the training they need and the right resources they need to scale. So I'd say that's how we look at it on our end. We certainly are interested in kind of getting more involved in workforce development programs as a whole, but we are doing it more so from, the early stage and the founder perspective.
And just to build upon that, EJ definitely takes a similar approach. So I really think things like this renewable energy boom that's here and going to just explode out of control is going to somewhat unleash a war over the talent for these green jobs. I really think the truth is sometimes there just aren't enough skilled workers to support the potential pipeline of work. So what EJ is doing is very similar to you in that we're taking the opportunity to continually invest in our people and the talent that does exist, first by reskilling and upskilling the workers that we do have, by providing opportunities for employees to obtain additional certifications like a Tesla EV installer cert, and essentially just providing the educational backbone that will allow existing workers to be flexible and smoothly transition over to new roles. And then just secondly is by focusing on developing, training, and educating the incoming workforce and the workforce of the future by partnering with local schools, programs, and nonprofit. And a great example of this is our partnership with NEW, which is non-traditional employment for women, and they prepare, train, and place women in careers in construction and the trades. And what they're doing is so important because not only does it create a pipeline of qualified workers to the industry where green jobs are in demand, but it also helps women achieve economic independence with a focus on women in underserved communities, which we really support.
Keith, would you be able to talk a bit more on kind of the particular skill sets that you see within the broader building space from an energy perspective and kind of the type of workers that you're looking for and how you look for that kind of talent?
Sure. I think to the earlier question, I think it's a broad mix. And I think to King's point, yeah, you have to first meet people where they are. So, one of the things we do as we build out our workforce, we identify what existing skills they have already, right? No matter if you've never been in this quote unquote climate tech industry or green jobs, there's a set of skills you have that can be transferable, right? Whether it's soft skills where you can do marketing and outreach and be kind of a, business development, or whether you're more of a hands-on person that requires an extra set of training around construction, whether it's like, physical, otherwise. And then finally, more for the Generation Z, millennial, more Generation Z generation that has no interest in physical labor. It's not a negative. It's just, every generation has a different style of what they're focused on. The idea of software and utilizing technology to run things, it's something that they've lived with all their lives. So that's exciting to think about. What is a smart building, right? What is a smart car? What does that mean? How can you be innovative? So it's layers, right? Because even in any situation, you need all three. Someone's got to market and educate folks on the given products, right? Whether it's wind with Russ or anyone, or someone's got to install it, right? And someone's got to manage it. So for, when we look at workforce and the workforce we're doing now, we're constantly, identifying folks on different levels, right? And trying to figure out what skills they need. I do think folks who have been historically underserved in the construction industry that are now taking a second look or now have more opportunities, to Katie's point, I do think there's more excitement about working in the industry, not just because of being actually allowed to work in the industry, but also working in their own communities, frontline communities. So, a lot of our workforce participants are working within their community. So they're training, in the Bronx, and they're installing Wi-Fi in the Bronx, or, they're learning how to install HVAC in Queens, and then they're on a site in Queens in their area. So, the equity and wealth are staying within the community, and they're able to take these skills and be career ready. So I think that's what we do. That's what we continue to do. And, hopefully we can scale and take it to other places.
So let me just jump in on real quick on the offshore wind industry. So, the offshore wind industry is in a unique space in this conversation. It is an industry right now where there are only seven turbines in the ocean, in the Atlantic Ocean off the coast of the United States right now. On the other hand, there are 5,000 off the coast of Europe. And so we're about to experience a once in a lifetime opportunity in a transition to offshore wind. There are a number of stars that are aligning right now for that are driving the market, and it's on the precipice of significant growth. And according to the White House, there's a goal to install 30 gigawatts of offshore wind by 2030. That meeting that installation goal would generate about 44,000 jobs and about $12 billion in capital each year, capital investment each year to meet those goals. The jobs in offshore wind that we're seeing right now, because, as I said, there's only seven. Most of these are the project development and the getting the project off the ground and running. So they are the white collar jobs at the moment, just at the moment, right? You have the engineers, you have project managers, you have finance, you have legal. However, those jobs are opening up the pathway for the construction and installation jobs. You're building and construction trades. Your operation and maintenance jobs. So they're opening up, creating the pathway. And the jobs that we'll be seeing in New York, and in specific as a result of this project development, is you're going to be seeing a lot of work at ports, assembling. You're going to be assembling and marshaling the large components. So you're going to have riggers and stevedores and laborers and people that would be assembling and welding the large steel components at the ports. But again, right now, that hiring is not happening. What's happening is people are preparing and beginning to develop the training programs to get this to be ready, because we're going to see our first major construction of an offshore wind power plant start next year. The Vineyard Wind Project, which is off the coast of Massachusetts, which will be 74 turbines. So they'll be starting to put steel in the water next year, and that's when you'll see a lot of the building and construction trades jobs come in place, because the offshore wind industry, the major components of jobs are in construction and installation and in manufacturing. So those are your middle skills, that some people like to call them jobs. The ones that you can enter out of with a high school diploma and a little bit of extra training to get on board. So there's a great opportunity that's heading into the New York area soon, while people like myself, the lawyers and the financiers, are opening up and kind of setting up the groundwork to make sure that we can start hiring and building out the projects.
And so then to that point, you've all touched on the equity piece, this variety across the economy, equity is as a challenge, but particularly in growth sectors and especially things like tech, we see greater disparities on making sure that communities of color, environmental justice communities are integrated into the process. And that, of course, becomes even more difficult when you're talking about, I would say, perceptions of green jobs being ones that require an engineering degree or some kind of master's degree. So what are some successful programs that you've seen or in ways that you partner with communities to kind of create alternative talent pipelines and hiring pipelines? And how would you say are some advice for workforce development programs that are rooted in community to partner with you? Already in the chat, we've been seeing a lot of those kinds of requests for partnership. So what would be some advice for strong forms of partnership, whether that's curriculum development or on the hiring end? And anyone that would like to start, you're welcome to.
I mean, I can go first. I think with any, with any workforce, anything around local hiring communities, you need strong local partners and partners that have trust and integrity and know what they're doing. So I think I looked at the attendees and one of them was on a call for like a Green City Force, Tanya Gale and her team, like, the ability to train locally, get a group of folks together, youth that are ready to get on the ground and do work is amazing. I also think as you do that, you overlap understanding what the opportunities are and set the right expectations. I think many times, I think Russ talked about it a little bit, Katie, what are the expectations we're putting out there for a type of job or type of jobs available. So I do think expectations are important, and expectations within your partners and your stakeholders. So, if we're offering X, we want to commit to X. Obviously, things change sometimes, but we want to commit to it. And then finally, making sure you're capitalized and the investment is there, right? Making sure that you have the money, working with folks like Chante to make sure that, you have an investment, you have capital, and you're able to move as quickly as possible when the opportunity arises. And then tell the success stories. The one thing some people are not good at, and is not to follow their own, like tell the success stories that folks went from A to B, talk about it. Talk about how someone went from, hey, I didn't know what a green job is. Now I'm installing solar panels. I'm installing wind turbines. Talk about it. And that story, a set of stories, provides trust and integrity and lets people know, hey, this is real. This is not just an idea. It's not something that Keith or anyone has made up. It's happening. And I know that person, or that person lives in my community. I think that total process is important, right? As we do the work now, and it's great that people are training and are working, but we want to tell those stories, right? We want to use those to scale. So I think those are the things that are important.
From the offshore wind industry perspective, we actually have a really excellent opportunity here. We're creating a whole new industry from the ground up, and we have the opportunity to right the wrongs of the past by being on the ground and starting this whole new industry from scratch. So what I'm seeing from our members and from the industry is that there's a lot of outreach that has been happening. There's been outreach to diverse communities that I haven't seen in other energy sectors in the past. We ourselves at the Business Network have partnered with New York, two of our members, New York City Economic Development Corporation and New Jersey Economic Development Authority, to put together, we did these Offshore Wind 101 training programs. It's a basically introduction to offshore wind industry and to the supply chain, which we tapped into New York City Economic Development Corporations and New Jersey EDA's registered MWBE lists. And we marketed the Offshore Wind 101 directly to minority and women-owned businesses. Why? Because our members in the industry wants to see diversity. So what do you need to do? You need to go out and get out to the streets. Well, in this case, it's the Zoom streets, but we got out there, and we started to have events where you started to have conversation. We also we hosted a workforce summit this past August at our International Partnering Forum, and we focused on two subjects. One, the industry needs, and the second was diversity, equity, and inclusion. And so we are having the conversations as an emerging industry now, and we're bringing in academia, labor unions, business and industry, and all and community organizations to have conversations now about what needs to be done in order to do it right.
Yeah, I'm happy to jump in. I think, you know, a lot of what Keith mentioned resonates for how we think about just what it looks like for folks to play a role, I think, across education period, obviously from an equitable standpoint, and that we want all communities involved. But I really think the curriculum development and educating people, particularly helping them recognize like what are their transferable skills. I think oftentimes people think that they're, you know, they have to sort of go out and get an entire new set of skills when that's actually not the reality oftentimes. I think particularly when we look at green jobs, you know, sustainability is everywhere. It's not really a choice anymore, you know, whether you're talking to corporates, whether you're talking to government, whether you're looking at the innovation and startup ecosystem, the investment side, philanthropy and foundations, everyone is figuring out how can they play a role in mitigating the climate crisis. And so I think really, you know, the best thing that anyone can do, particularly those who have the power to help train and help reach those who are maybe concerned about the future of their jobs or feel like they're unsure about what it looks like for them to be a part of this economy, is to really help them understand not only what the opportunities are, but also what are those skills that people are looking for. And I think once they identify that, you know, they can also identify gaps and say, hey, well, actually, these are the things that I've always done. They're transferable, but I learned about something new. And I want to be able to dive into that specific topic and build that skill. And I think that there's a lot of opportunity there. I met a guy named Brendan who runs a hiring firm now called Climate People, and he started it about 2 years ago. I think he's already placed over 5,000 people who wanted to transition into clean jobs. And so I think, you know, that's how big the market is. That's how much appetite there is for new types of roles. And I think that's also how many jobs are just coming online. I know I get reached out to recruiters now just nonstop, right? And so I think there's really an opportunity to show the abundance, right? And show that, you know, that we're not going back to what was, so let's focus on what will be. And I think those who understand that and really prioritize that are going to be the ones who see the most benefit for either their existing employers, the existing members that they serve, and those who really do and should be able to access, right, a lot of these jobs that, you know, don't really require much more than what you're already doing. And so I think that's a really important piece that we like to focus on, is sort of what can people be doing regardless of sector, regardless of background. It's really like, how do you identify those skills and use them in this space?
Great. And it sounds like we have quite a lot of work on our end to do to start connecting some of our members to you all to start getting this work done on the ground. Katie, if you don't mind, you already talked about the new partnership. So I'm just going to move on to the last quick public policy element. We've all seen that this is kind of a sector that is very influenced by public policy. Are there any things that you're seeing on the horizon on your end that we need to push for from the advocacy side that will help kind of open up even more business capacity and even more workforce partnerships that you need in order for kind of your sectors to flourish, and where should we be pushing for that?
I'll start with there. I think we're in New York State, and I think we're fortunate over the last 10, 12 years. We've had strong government that has been on the forefront of these industries we've talked about on a state and city level, at times where at federal level, we're not on the same page. Now, thankfully, we have real federal leadership where, you know, we can now take federal dollars with state dollars and city dollars and really begin to scale and really build out workforce and infrastructure and really build out the green jobs economy. So I do think, you know, over the next year or so, the ability to leverage federal dollars, subsidies with state and city dollars is important. I know there's a bunch of bills sitting in the federal side that we're hoping to pass. That's one. I do think on a city and state level, continuing to have conversations with the private sector on how we engage building owners in the market to make sure our incentives match up with what quote unquote customers need are important, right? And I do think to this point on the state and city level, they've both done a great job in having conversations with folks like us on the call about what needs to happen on the ground to scale energy efficiency, while at the same time creating jobs for folks on the ground. I do think, as always, and I think everyone will agree with me here, there needs to be more money, right? Just across the board, a lot more money, like 8, 9, figure dollars on this. But we have to make sure it gets to the right hands, right? I think Chante was right that the industry has been, not as inclusive as it should be over the last decades or two. And then we want to make sure the dollars are used, by the right people, right? If we're going to deal in frontline communities, get down to Black and Brown communities or low to moderate income communities, regardless of demographics, we want to make sure that they are benefiting not just from the upgrades of buildings or putting in, wind turbines or any other jobs, but also generating wealth, right, through contractor jobs as well. The one thing we don't talk about a lot, and even I do it sometimes, and it's on me. Talk about jobs a lot. It's really nice. There needs to be like more, contractor companies that are owned by women, right? There needs to be more places that quote unquote are non-traditional spaces for women. That needs to change. So, how can we make sure the industry that's been, predominantly male for the sake of time does not look that way in this decade, as we're still in the midst of a health crisis, racial crisis, and an economic crisis. So I think that's very important.
And I'll add to that. I remember last year there was a community hiring economic justice plan, and I felt like that worked really well because all stakeholders really got to work collaboratively. Client agencies, local business units, organizations towards economic justice. And what they did was they put in place PLAs, project labor agreements, where the city works with the building industry to connect working people in the neighborhoods across the city to either union apprenticeships or pre-apprenticeship programs. And they use the PLA to really address some of those economic disparities and really a way to connect low-income New Yorkers to good jobs and quality opportunities. So I think there's some opportunity to repeat that throughout the city. But just as Keith said, I think, money, investment, financing, funding, the government can put more money into the space to help migrate the economy from a fossil-based economy to a green and clean economy that benefits all.
Yeah, I'll piggyback on the money thing, because how could you not? Look, there's we did, as you all know, and people participating in this, you work in the workforce development space. You know that workforce and job training has been woefully and inadequately funded for decades, right? So that's definitely something that needs a focus, right? Both on the state level and the federal level. And on a federal level, there is, and it's worked its way into the budget reconciliation process. There is a program called the Offshore Wind Jobs and Opportunities Act, and it is a funding stream that would set up $25 million a year, and it's federal, so not as it would be great, but more would also help because we have to train a lot of workers to get the industry off the ground, but. $25 million a year. So if you could support that in the federal budget, that would be great. And then on the state front, New York State has a training fund for offshore wind. It's a $20 million fund that has been allocated to, is being administered rather by SUNY Stony Brook and Farmingdale State College in a joint process. They're helping getting them and advocating for them to be rolling that funds out and moving that money to the ground and also getting it to the frontline communities would be helpful, right? Because right now that money is probably going to wind up in great SUNY programs, but it should wind up in the frontline communities at the South Brooklyn Marine Terminal, where they're going to be doing construction for the Equinor project. We need to train people to do welding and on the ground there in South Brooklyn Marine Terminal. So helping push that money out of the state SUNY system and onto the ground and into the hands of the communities, as Keith is shaking his head and understands. That's what needs to happen.
And I'll just quickly add, I think ultimately government is the customer for a lot of the founders we work with, or they have a lot of control over what the customer prioritizes. And so I think there's a huge role for policy to really drive deployment of solutions. And ultimately the deployment of solutions means the allowance for more jobs, right? And more access, I think, to training programs that can get people into these roles. I think the other thing that I think a lot about, leading investment for SecondMuse is, there's so much money going into investment. I threw the $17 million number out previously. The reality is that billions of dollars are going into the sector, and it's anticipated it'll be $1 trillion sector. And so a lot of what we've been doing is asking the question, sort of what's the role of philanthropy and the investor itself, right? That will ultimately in large part be able to benefit from a lot of incentives that exist on the government on the government side to really reinvest in the ecosystem and the workforce development piece. And so I think there's early conversations around that, and I think we're hopeful that we can drive, investors and philanthropic dollars towards things like this.
Great, thank you. Definitely going to be ramping up our advocacy on all of these fronts. So very, very excited to work with you and everybody that's on the call today. So we're just gonna, unfortunately, we only have about 15 minutes left. So we're gonna jump to a more expedited Q&A. So our first question comes from Reagan LaRussa, who's a fellow with America Works. Reagan, the floor is yours.
Hi, so I'm doing research on the possibility of service years as an opportunity for people to grow the skills that they need, particularly entry-level candidates. And so I'm curious to hear your thoughts on how that can be leveraged as an opportunity to get people into the green workforce, or even, for example, if you're familiar with AmeriCorps, the aspect of the AmeriCorps program that does the NCCC, which is, I believe, where they go out and work in state parks or national landmarks. So I'm curious to know how you think that we could leverage service year opportunities like AmeriCorps or City Year as an opportunity to get people those skills and get them into the green job space.
I think well, first, thanks for that question. I'm glad AmeriCorps is thinking about this. I'll go back to what I said earlier. I think identifying first what AmeriCorps members individually have interest in is helpful. I do think there are ways, even, we still live in a COVID-19 world where folks may not want to go into buildings or do certain types of work. One of the things is just, collecting data, right? Whether it's health data or building data, walking around buildings externally or taking information. Just as one thought. The other thought is, learning more about the industry on a software level, right? If it means folks have to sit in a classroom and take a virtual Wi-Fi training or take a training on how to build something, I think, and I say that just because I know, to Ross's point, not everything is going to be accessible right away based on where we are still in this pandemic. And I think finally, getting the right mentors in place, for every skill set historically that, whether it's a foreman or apprenticeship or something, of course, the trades, there's always been someone to say, hey, we're going to help you. The one thing about this industry, though, it does dovetail with construction and kind of general work. Some of it is still relatively new, right? So the question is, can you get the right people in front of the, AmeriCorps members to talk through what the next steps are, what it looks like moving forward? So folks like Ross, folks like Katie, myself, Chante, who can help with that process. It sounds like I'm giving a vague answer, but it's actually a good thing because there's so much room around it. This is an industry that's 100 years old, and we're trying to fix it or move it 2 or 3 inches. This is a very new, still emerging industry on so many levels. So I don't want to pigeonhole and tell AmeriCorps members just do this and keep it here. I think there's room for that, but that's what my recommendation would be on workforce, to be as open as possible around every aspect of a climate tech job or a climate tech opportunity.
Thank you, Keith. The next question is from Rafia Zahir Udin, who is Vice President of Global Philanthropy at JP Morgan. Go ahead.
Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for taking time to speak on this panel today. I found it very informative. As someone who's in philanthropy, part of our challenge in funding jobs in the green economy is there just aren't enough replicable models in New York City, or there are very few. So I'd love to hear from you any sort of workforce development training models that warrant further inquiry or are worth replicating or scaling. And then how do we work more broadly with training providers to think about what opportunities we should be building out trainings for? Because it seems like providers are also stretched to figure out where do we create a program and what should it look like?
I'll jump in real quick. Thank you for that question. And I'm going to go back to my experience at the Workforce Development Institute. One of the things that we found at the Workforce Development Institute found very, very important, and this was pre-COVID. So, but it was at a time when people, were hiring. I mean, there was lower levels of unemployment than we're seeing now. But soft skills was an area where there was an area that was constantly being told by utility industries, electrical contracts, and others that were missing from the workforce. So, pre-employment training programs are excellent models. Whether you don't need them to look just at the green energy sector, but pre-employment training overall would be really helpful, because soft skills, basic math skills, communication skills are skills that I've been told, at least that I had seen, that employers were saying were missing at a time when, hiring was at a different level than now. But soft skills will be something that will get you throughout a career. And so I think pre-employment training is a great way to get people on the right pathway. And they're very replicable models. There are bunches of them out there to look at.
Yeah, I'd add, there's a lot of labs that have existed for a while, like ARPA-E, and you've seen really successful spin outs of companies that are now, either based in certain cities or just scaling across the country and creating a large number of jobs. I feel like that model is replicable. We've seen it work. And I think there is a role, as I was alluding to earlier, for philanthropy to play in really helping us build these technology solutions and these innovative ideas that ultimately will be at the forefront of our economy and already are, really. And so I think there are models that exist, and I think there's an opportunity to also maybe expand the way that philanthropy has looked at workforce development, and also how that can be tied into the equity conversation that we're having today.
I'll just add briefly. We're finishing up our workforce program at the end of this year, so I have no problem providing kind of a broad kind of scope of work done, and kind of as we're developing a white paper. So I have no problem doing that to be helpful, because what we're doing is scalable, and I'm pretty sure we'll be doing it in other cities over the next year or two. Obviously, they'll say if you get it done here, you can do it anywhere. So I think we've done a good job so far in New York, and we're going to take it on the road to other wonderful cities in this great nation.
Yeah, I forgot to give the name of that program. One of the pre-employment training programs. It was called the Urgent Program. And it was about training non-traditionals to get into the energy sector, and it was focused. It was the cohorts were women at the time, and so it was helping women get basic education on the energy sector, as well as doing resume skills, soft skills, power presentations, and things of that nature.
And I'm going to put my advocate hat on in this and answer as well that one of the major challenges that we see from a workforce development provider perspective is that there's such a lack of funding for collaborations between two service providers. So let's say a community-based organization into a community college as a way to kind of attack the equity piece, to make sure that people know about these training programs, are having access to programs, like building out bridge programs that would be able to get people. So for example, something like New that Katie mentioned is connecting people in a pre-apprenticeship model, but there's also lots of other bridge programs that the model exists, but the program itself doesn't. Or let's say, and that kind of funding is really difficult because that requires such a form of flexibility and build out that most funding does not currently provide. I would also say funding for not just scaling up programs, but really creating kind of offshoots of different programs that might not have a green component that we've talked about so far, but helping them add that into their programming. So I think this sector gives us a lot of ability to be innovative, but in order for programs to do that, they need to have a bit more open-ended funding to do the research, to do the collaborations, the connections, the partnerships to connect to all of these employer partners. And current structures just really don't do that because they're always asking for job outcomes. And as we've seen, it's just that'll take a little bit more time. So we'll move on to our next question from Andel Koester, who is a director at CARP Strategies. Andel?
Hi, Andel Koester with CARP Strategies. I'm wondering if you foresee any risk of a lag between employers identifying the skills that they need and the ability of a training program to provide training on those skills in a manner that's fast enough to meet that need.
I mean, I'll speak to the tech side, certainly. I think, you know, any of the solutions that we're seeing, especially I think if you look at a sector like software, right? Like there's just so many upgrades that happen consistently. I think a way to get around that, one thing I didn't mention earlier is there are like a bunch of communities popping up, and this is particularly on the innovation side, but what we're seeing is a bunch of sectors or folks from different sectors join in these communities. One is Terra.do, which was actually found by an incredible climate scientist who wanted to educate more people to bring them into this space. And so she runs it's a startup model that she runs a number of just back-to-back training programs and education programs for people who want to learn about climate science, VCs who want to invest, sort of transition into climate investment, policymakers who want to understand what are other cities doing, what are other regions doing, because I think the reality is that there are other countries that many would argue are at the forefront of, you know, climate policy and really moving the needle in certain sectors. And so I think one way for us to look at it is to say, how do we actually not silo these trainings? And oftentimes in the way that they happen, how can we actually have people from different sectors learning together, pushing each other, sort of talking about, you know, well, this is what I'm seeing on the tech side, right? We think a lot about AI and the automation of things, which I know might really scare this crowd. And it is a part of the conversation, right? And so I think not ignoring that and not pulling away from that, but leaning into it and saying, well, how can we prepare our workers and how do we have more of these honest conversations? And so I think that can inform the training, the curriculum, and it really should be an iterative process. It shouldn't be like, we launched this program, it's going to run the same for the next 3 years, and maybe we'll circle back and see if we need to update it. It should be a constant, you know, are we up to date on the most recent science, the most recent technology, the most recent business models and impact models?
Yeah, and I could just add a little bit, the same for the construction industry as a whole. We're trying to be more proactive as opposed to reactive to avoid that lag, but I do see it when it comes to training on technology application, adaptation, and maintenance.
Oh, sorry, I was muted. I don't think the gap will be as, I think the gap that people are talking about in one sense is non-existent. I think if we cast a wide net, as we've all talked about across this call, I think we'll be in a position where we have generally speaking, a strong pool of candidates to pull from. I think when we don't cast a wide net and we're pulling from the same areas we pulled on for many years, we'll always have that labor, quote unquote, labor shortage that everyone talks about. I will admit, innovation moves very quickly, and there are times where people are not going to be, and to Chante's point, we're going to have some lag on the innovation side, but that lag should not prevent scalability, and we just have to, be willing to move very quickly and shift to move forward. But I do think overall we're in a good position to address the needs that are in front of us.
I don't know if I'm concerned about the lags, but yeah, I mean, I am a little bit, but what I'm really concerned about is when training providers and colleges and others go off and create programs without connecting with the industry, the people that are actually going to be doing the hiring. So regardless of how quick it's happening, make sure that you have a group of advisors from the industry that are actually doing the work as you're developing your curriculums. And that'll help to avoid some of those gaps by really having them on the ground and as a part of your process and your development team when you're developing the curriculum.
Well, with that more kind of collaborative, hopeful note, we definitely, that's the goal of this particular type of event. And this is just the beginning of conversations. We definitely are looking forward to turning the conversations into connections and conversations and advisory boards. There have been a lot of questions in the chat about how can we connect? How can there be, we can have you participate in training programs or facility visits. So we definitely will facilitate some kind of connections, obviously, however everybody wants to participate. So again, just super appreciate all of your time and insight. This has been an incredibly illuminating conversation. And again, our members don't get to hear directly from employers. So super appreciate you, Chante, Ross, Keith, and Katie. And we'll definitely have you back for a next round of conversations. So with that, we conclude our first installment in our Industry Needs by Sector series. We hope that you will join us for our next conversations. The first one will be on Thursday, November 18th for a conversation around the state of tech. This will be followed by the state of healthcare on Thursday, November 9th. And we'll kick off 2022 with events on retail and hospitality, the building trades, and media and entertainment in January, February, and March, respectively. We hope you stay tuned for more speaker announcements, which you can always see on nycetc.org/events or the RSVP link in the chat to register for those events moving forward. Of course, you can always get more updates on our newsletter, which comes out every Wednesday. So thank you all for joining us this afternoon. And of course, once again, thank you to our panelists. Enjoy the rest of your day.